There exists a peculiar ritual that has haunted bathroom mirrors across America for decades. Stand before the glass, dim the lights, and speak his name 5 times. Candyman, 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 Candyman. What follows, according to legend, is an encounter with one of horror cinema's most chilling antagonists, a spectre armed with a hook and surrounded by a swarm of vengeful bees. But this isn't merely the product of Hollywood imagination or creative screenwriting. The Candyman legend is anchored in something far more disturbing: the intersection of America's brutal racial history and a series of genuine crimes, so bizarre they seem ripped from a nightmare. The story of Candyman transcends typical horror movie fare. It represents a unique convergence where historical atrocity, urban decay, actual criminal activity, and supernatural folklore merge into a single, unforgettable narrative. To understand why this particular legend has such lasting power, we must journey into the dark corners of American history and the grim realities of urban life in late 20th century Chicago. What we discover is that sometimes reality provides the most terrifying stories of all. The historical foundation, racial violence, and forbidden love. At the heart of the Candyman mythology lies Daniel Robital, a fictional character whose backstory draws from very real historical horrors. According to the film's narrative, Robital was the son of an enslaved person who achieved remarkable success as a portrait artist in post-Civil War America. His talent earned him commissions from wealthy families, but his skill would ultimately become his downfall. When hired to paint the portrait of a beautiful white woman from a prominent family, the unthinkable happened: they fell in love. In the racially charged atmosphere of post-Reconstruction America, this romance represented the ultimate transgression. The relationship between a black man and a white woman violated every social code of the era, threatening the racial hierarchy that white society desperately sought to maintain. When their affair was discovered, a lynch mob hunted Robital down. What followed was an act of barbarism that exemplified the worst of human cruelty. The mob severed his right hand, replacing it with the hook that would become his signature weapon. They then covered his body in stolen honeycomb and allowed bees to sting him repeatedly until he died in unimaginable agony. His final moments were consumed with rage, pain, and a desire for vengeance that would transcend death itself. While Daniel Robital himself is fictional, every element of his story reflects authentic historical trauma. Lynching was not an aberration in American history, but a systematic tool of racial terror. Between the 1880s and 1960s, thousands of African Americans were murdered by mobs, often for alleged crimes that ranged from the serious to the utterly trivial. Many were killed for violating racial etiquette, looking at a white woman, disputing a business transaction, or simply being successful enough to inspire jealousy among white neighbors. The specific fear of interracial relationships was particularly potent. The myth of black males' sexual aggression toward white women was weaponized to justify countless acts of violence. Even consensual relationships, when discovered, could result in brutal punishment for the black partner, while the white partner might be portrayed as a victim in need of protection. This double standard reflected deeper anxieties about racial purity, power dynamics, and the maintenance of white supremacy. The filmmakers behind Candyman understood that, by grounding their supernatural villain in this historical reality, they could create something more powerful than a simple monster. Candyman becomes a manifestation of historical guilt, the ghost of past atrocities that refuses to be forgotten or forgiven. His vengeance is not random but directed, emerging from genuine grievance. The supernatural elements: his immortality, his ability to appear when summoned, his control over bees transform historical trauma into an active, ongoing threat. The past, the film suggests, is never truly past. The urban setting, Cabrini-Green, and the geography of Fear the Candyman films are inseparable from their urban setting, specifically the Cabrini-Green housing projects on Chicago's near North Side. Understanding this location is crucial to grasping the full scope of the legend. Cabrini-Green was built with noble intentions to provide affordable housing for working class families in the post-World War II era. The original row houses, constructed in the 1940s, were followed by high-rise towers in the 1950s and 1960s. At its peak, Cabrini-Green housed approximately 15,000 residents. However, by the 1970s and 1980s, Cabrini-Green had become synonymous with urban decay, gang violence, and institutional neglect. The high-rise towers, once symbols of modern urban planning, had transformed into vertical warrens of poverty and crime. Elevators frequently broke down, forcing residents to climb dark stairwells where danger lurked. Maintenance was sporadic at best. Gang activity flourished in the corridors and courtyards. The police, when they arrived at all, often seemed more like an occupying force than community protectors. The residents of Cabrini-Green lived with daily threats that most Americans could scarcely imagine. Sniper fire from rival gang members made walking outside dangerous. Children grew up distinguishing between different types of gunfire. The infrastructure crumbled while the city seemed to look away, content to let Cabrini-Green become a concentrated zone of poverty that kept poor black residents contained and separate from wealthier, whiter neighborhoods just blocks away. This was the environment into which Bernard rose. The director of the original Candyman film transplanted his horror story. The genius of this choice was recognizing that Cabrini-Green already existed in the American imagination as a place of fear. For suburban audiences, these housing projects represented everything threatening about the inner city. Rose understood that by setting his supernatural tale in this real location, he could tap into pre-existing anxieties while also critiquing them. The film forces viewers to confront their own complicity in creating places like Cabrini-Green. The monster isn't just Candyman. It's also the systems that produce concentrated poverty, that segregate cities by race and class, that allow communities to deteriorate while politicians and media figures treat them as cautionary tales, rather than neighborhoods full of real people deserving of basic services and dignity. The true crime that inspired terror. Ruthie Mae McCoy's most chilling aspect of the Candyman legend is how closely it mirrors actual criminal activity that occurred at Cabrini-Green in the 1980s. This is where urban legend intersects with documented true crime, creating a story so disturbing that it seems almost impossible. In April 1987, a woman named Ruthie Mae McCoy placed a frantic call to 911 from her apartment in Cabrini-Green. Her report seemed almost delusional. She claimed that someone was trying to break into her home through the bathroom medicine cabinet. To the dispatcher, this must have seemed like the confused report of someone experiencing a mental health crisis. How could anyone possibly enter an apartment through a medicine cabinet mounted on a wall? The call was noted, but the response was not immediate. Tragically, by the time police officers arrived at McCoy's apartment, she had been shot and killed. The investigation that followed uncovered a shocking truth that would haunt the imagination of anyone who heard it. When investigators examined the bathroom medicine cabinet, they discovered that it wasn't mounted against a solid wall, but rather against a thin partition separating McCoy's apartment from the vacant unit next door. More importantly, they found that the back panel of the medicine cabinet could be easily removed. This architectural feature, likely a cost-saving measure during construction, had created an unintentional network of passages through the building. Criminals had discovered this vulnerability and exploited it with devastating efficiency. By entering vacant apartments, and there were many in Cabrini-Green, as residents fled the deteriorating conditions, they could remove the back panels of medicine cabinets and crawl through the wall into occupied units. Residents would be going about their daily lives when suddenly someone would emerge from their bathroom, appearing almost magically through the mirror. The discovery confirmed what residents had been reporting for months. People were indeed coming through the mirrors. What had seemed like urban legend or paranoid delusion was horrifyingly real. Multiple break-ins had occurred using this method. Ruthie Mae McCoy's murder was the most extreme outcome, but many others had been robbed, terrorized, or assaulted by intruders who seemed to materialize out of nowhere. This true crime story contains all the elements of effective horror. There's the violation of domestic space. The home, which should be our safest refuge, becomes penetrable and dangerous. There's the impossible made real, the mirror, as portal isn't supernatural but architectural. There's the failure of authorities to believe and protect. McCoy reported the truth and was not taken seriously until it was too late. And there's the broader context of neglect. These architectural vulnerabilities existed because the building's residents were deemed unworthy of proper construction and maintenance. From true crime to cinema, Bernard Rose's adaptation. Bernard Rose, a British director, came across these true events while researching urban legends for his adaptation of Clive Barker's short story, The Forbidden. Barker's original tale was set in Liverpool, England, and dealt with class dynamics and the horror of poverty in British housing estates. Rose recognized that transplanting the story to Chicago, specifically to Cabrini-Green, would allow him to explore American racial history and urban decay in ways that would give the material additional resonance. The genius of Rose's adaptation lies in how he wove together multiple threads. Barker's original narrative about a graduate student investigating urban legends, the historical trauma of racial violence, the specific true crimes at Cabrini-Green, and supernatural horror conventions. The result was a film that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Rose retained Barker's premise of an outsider studying folklore. Helen Lyle, the film's protagonist, is a graduate student working on her thesis about urban legends. She approaches the Candyman story with academic detachment, viewing it as a fascinating example of contemporary mythology emerging from inner-city communities. Her perspective is analytical, even somewhat condescending. She sees herself as enlightened, able to understand these legends as cultural phenomena rather than literal truths. This character choice is crucial because it mirrors the position of the film's likely audience edge. Middle-class viewers who live far from places like Cabrini-Green and understand them primarily through media representations. Helen becomes a surrogate for the audience, and her journey from skepticism to horrified belief parallels what Rose hopes will be the viewer's own transformation by placing the medicine cabinet break-ins into his narrative. Rose grounds the supernatural in documented reality. When characters in the film mention people coming through the mirrors, viewers familiar with Ruthie Mae McCoy's case recognize the reference. The film suggests that perhaps the supernatural Candyman legend grew from these real crimes. Or perhaps the crimes themselves were influenced by the pre-existing legend. This ambiguity, the blurred line between real crime and supernatural vengeance, creates additional layers of unease. Rose also made the crucial decision to cast Tony Todd as Candyman, bringing gravitas and tragic dignity to the character. Todd's performance ensures that Candyman is never merely a slasher villain. There's intelligence, pain, and a terrible purpose behind those eyes. When he speaks of his history, his voice carries the weight of centuries of injustice. He becomes simultaneously victim and monster, someone who was destroyed by racism and who now perpetuates violence. This complexity elevates the entire film. The symbolism, mirrors, bees, and blood. The Candyman legend employs several key symbols that carry deep meaning beyond their surface horror. Understanding these symbols reveals why the legend has such lasting, psychological power. The mirror serves as the primary portal between worlds. Mirrors have always occupied a strange place in human consciousness. They reflect reality, but also distort it. In folklore, across cultures, mirrors are liminal objects, thresholds between the material world and spiritual realms. They can trap souls, reveal hidden truths, or serve as doorways for entities to cross over. When you say Candyman's name into a mirror 5 times, you're not just calling to him, you're opening yourself to what he represents. The mirror also functions as a symbol of self-reflection in the psychological sense. To summon Candyman is to confront historical truths that society would prefer to keep hidden. The reflection looking back at you carries the weight of collective guilt. When white characters summon Candyman, they're calling forth the consequences of racial violence their society perpetrated. The mirror forces confrontation with uncomfortable realities. The bees are perhaps the most visceral element of Candyman's iconography. They emerge from his body, swarming from his mouth and the cavity where his chest should be. These bees serve multiple symbolic functions. First, they're a permanent reminder of his torture. The instrument of his death becomes part of his undead existence. Second, they represent collective action. Individual bees are relatively harmless, but a swarm becomes deadly. This mirrors how individual acts of racism combine into systemic oppression. Third, bees are associated with sweetness. They make honey, yet they also sting. This duality reflects Candyman's origin in forbidden love that turned deadly. The hook replacing Candyman's severed hand is the most obvious symbol. It's the mark of his mutilation, the permanent evidence of what was done to him. In life, his hands created beauty through art. In death, his single remaining hand has been replaced with an instrument of violence. The hook represents the transformation of the artist into the avenger, the victim into the monster. It's also phallic in its symbolism, tying back to the sexual anxieties that motivated his murder, the fear of black, male sexuality that haunted white supremacist imagination. Blood in the Candyman films flows freely, marking victims and painting walls. Blood represents both literal violence and genealogical connection. Candyman's bloodline, born from an enslaved woman, connects him to generations of trauma. The blood of his victims becomes part of an ongoing cycle, evidence that historical violence continues to produce contemporary casualties. Helen Lyle, the dangerous scholar. The character of Helen Lyle deserves particular examination because her arc carries important warnings about privilege, appropriation, and the dangers of treating real trauma as academic material. Helen is a graduate student from a privileged background who becomes fascinated with the Candyman legend while researching urban myths. She sees this story as perfect thesis material, disturbing, rich with cultural meaning. Helen's approach is extractive. She enters Cabrini-Green as an outsider, armed with her education and her recording equipment, ready to collect stories from residents about Candyman. She wants the benefits of this researched, completed thesis, the academic recognition, perhaps eventual publication, without any genuine connection to or understanding of the community she's studying. The residents she interviews are subjects to her, sources of data rather than people with complex lives and valid fears. This dynamic reflects broader patterns of how privileged researchers have historically approached marginalized communities. There's a long tradition of academics and journalists entering poor neighborhoods, minority communities, or other marginalized spaces to extract stories, then departing to process these stories for audiences from their own social class. The community receives little benefit while their trauma becomes consumable content for others. Helen's skepticism about the legend is presented initially as rational scientific thinking, but it's also a form of dismissal. By insisting that Candyman cannot be real, she's implicitly suggesting that the fears of Cabrini-Green residents are irrational, that they're creating monsters where none exist. She fails to grasp that whether Candyman is literally supernatural or not, the fear is real, rooted in actual violence and danger. Her academic detachment blinds her to lived reality. The film punishes Helen for this approach. As she delves deeper into the legend, she doesn't just study Candyman, she becomes part of his story. He claims her, draws her into his narrative, until she cannot escape. Her transformation from skeptical researcher to believer to eventual victim serves as a cautionary tale. The legend isn't content to be studied. It demands recognition, belief, and ultimately sacrifice. Helen's fate also suggests something about the nature of storytelling itself. When you tell someone's story, particularly a story of trauma and violence, you take on responsibility. You become connected to that narrative in ways that can't be fully controlled. The story can claim you just as surely as you claim it. Helen wanted ownership of the Candyman legend for her academic career, but the legend took ownership of her instead. Why Candyman endures. The power of socially conscious horror. 3 decades after the original film's release, Candyman remains culturally relevant. The 2021 sequel reboot, directed by Nia DaCosta and produced by Jordan Peele, demonstrates the legend's continuing power. But what makes Candyman endure when countless other horror villains have faded from memory? The answer lies in the legend's foundation in real historical and social issues. Freddy Krueger is frightening, but he emerges from the pure nightmare logic of the unconscious mind. Jason Voorhees is relentless, but his origin story, while tragic, doesn't carry broader social implications. Michael Myers is terrifyingly motiveless, but that very lack of meaning limits his metaphorical power. Candyman, by contrast, means something. He represents specific historical traumas that haven't been resolved, ongoing social problems that remain unaddressed. Racial violence hasn't been relegated to history. Police shootings of unarmed black men, the persistence of hate crimes, disparities in criminal justice. These issues keep the themes of Candyman relevant. Urban poverty and the failure of public housing haven't disappeared. They've simply shifted locations as projects like Cabrini-Green have been demolished in favor of mixed-income developments that often displace original residents. The gentrification of formerly poor neighborhoods, the ongoing segregation of American cities, the ways poverty gets concentrated and contained. All these issues that Candyman explores remain current. The legend also endures because it refuses simple moral categories. Candyman is simultaneously victim and villain, sympathetic and terrifying. He was murdered unjustly, transformed by hatred into something monstrous. His vengeance is understandable, yet his methods are horrifying. He kills indiscriminately, but his rage has a clear source. This moral complexity makes him more interesting than typical slasher villains who are simply evil. Moreover, Candyman operates as social commentary in ways that don't feel heavy-handed. The film doesn't pause to deliver lectures about racism or urban policy. Instead, it embeds these themes into the horror itself. The scares and the social critique are inseparable. You can't watch Candyman and ignore what it's saying about race, class, and history, but neither does it feel like vegetables hidden in a dessert. The social content is integral to why the horror works. The legend also benefits from its ritual quality. The act of saying his name 5 times in a mirror is simple, memorable, and replicable. It's been absorbed into popular culture, showing up in countless other works, performed as a dare by teenagers, referenced in discussions of urban legends. This ritual keeps Candyman alive in public consciousness in ways that more complex summonings might not. Everyone understands how you call Candyman, and that simplicity makes the legend accessible and shareable. Conclusion: confronting the darkness behind the mirror, the story of Candyman ultimately forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about history, memory, and social responsibility. What happens to trauma that's never adequately addressed? What ghosts do we create when we try to forget terrible things rather than truly reckon with them? How do past injustices continue to haunt the present? The legend suggests that willful forgetting isn't possible. The past demands recognition. When society tries to move on without addressing historical wrongs, those wrongs don't disappear, they transform, festering beneath the surface, waiting to burst forth in destructive ways. Candyman becomes the return of the repressed, the manifestation of everything that's been denied, dismissed, or deliberately erased from collective memory. For those who study folklore and urban legends, Candyman represents something powerful, a legend that's simultaneously supernatural and grounded in documented truth. It shows how communities process trauma through storytelling, how real crimes can become mythologized, how history and horror intersect. The legend serves psychological and social functions, allowing people to express fears about violence, racism, and institutional neglect in narrative form. The transformation of Ruthie Mae McCoy's murder into the Candyman legend also demonstrates how true crime becomes folklore. Her death was real, her fear was valid, but her story has been absorbed into a larger narrative that includes supernatural elements. This transformation isn't disrespectful. It's how communities make meaning from tragedy, how they memorialize victims and warn others about dangers. The legend keeps her story alive, even as it changes the details. For viewers and fans of horror, Candyman offers a masterclass in how to create socially conscious, scary stories. It proves that horror can be both genuinely frightening and intellectually substantial, that you don't have to choose between delivering effective scares and saying something meaningful about society. The best horror has always reflected cultural anxieties, but Candyman does so with unusual directness and purpose. Perhaps most importantly, the Candyman legend reminds us that monsters don't appear from nowhere. We create them through our actions and inactions, through violence perpetrated and justice denied, through communities neglected and histories suppressed. The hook-handed spectre in the mirror is terrifying, but he's ultimately less frightening than the real-world conditions that produced him. So, Before you stand in front of your bathroom mirror and speak his name, consider what you're really invoking. You're not just calling a fictional boogeyman. You're summoning the ghosts of lynching victims, the spirits of those failed by urban policy, the accumulated rage of generations who suffered injustice. You're confronting everything that polite society prefers not to discuss. The question isn't whether Candyman is real. The question is whether you're brave enough to face what he represents. The legend endures because the problems it addresses endure. When America truly reckons with its history of racial violence, when cities genuinely commit to housing justice, when the traumas of the past are acknowledged and addressed rather than suppressed and forgotten, perhaps then Candyman will finally rest. Until that day, he waits behind the mirror, ready to appear when his name is spoken. A reminder that some ghosts refuse to be laid to rest.